Recent events surrounding Toronto City Council have many people angry and some confused. So let's clear the air a little bit. What exactly is the Notwithstanding Clause and why does it exist? Bill 5 in Ontario is called the Better Local Government Act of 2018. The point of this bill is to reduce the size of Toronto City Council from 47 members to 25. The idea behind Bill 5 is to improve the function of Toronto City Council. This would be done by aligning the municipal wards with the electoral districts of Ontario. In doing so, the city councillors would go from representing an average of 61,000 people per ward to 111,000 people per ward. While this would make their jobs much more difficult, the idea was that smaller government, less corruption, easier to work with. Originally, City Council was set to expand from 44 councillors to 47 councillors. This was reported in iHeartRadio on November 10, 2016. This is because the wards hadn't been reworked since the year 2000, and the wards would remain at 47 until the year 2030. The bill was introduced on July 30, 2018, and received royal assent on August 14, 2018. It was then challenged in the Ontario courts, where it was ruled on September 10th that it infringed on Section 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Values, violating both the candidates' and the voters' right to freedom of expression. In response to this, Premier Doug Ford enacted the Notwithstanding Clause. This gives him the authority to overrule the decision by Superior Court Justice Edward Belobaba.
I promise to reduce the size and cost of government and end their culture of waste and mismanagement in government. This is something I fought for at City Hall, something I continue to believe in today, and no one has ever said to me, Doug, we need more politicians. In fact, it's the opposite.
So, what is the Notwithstanding Clause? Section 33 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Values is known as the Notwithstanding Clause. It states, Parliament or the legislature of a province may expressly declare in an act of Parliament or in the legislature, as the case may be, that the act or a provision thereof shall operate notwithstanding a provision included in Section 2 or Section 7 to 15 of this Charter. This section allows the premiers of their respective province to overrule judicial ruling as well as charter freedoms to enact a law. The parts of the Charter it overrules is freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including the freedom of the press and other media of communication, freedom of peaceful assembly, and the freedom of association, right to life, liberty, and security, right against unreasonable search and seizure, right to not be arbitrarily detained and imprisoned, right to be informed of your imprisonment as well as the right to counsel, suspension of habeas corpus and to be released from an unlawful detention, right to a speedy trial, presumption of innocence, not to be tried again for the same crime, right to not be subjected to cruel and unusual punishment, and equality for all under the law, and not be discriminated based on race, nationality, or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disabilities. The Notwithstanding Clause has a 5-year limitation. During negotiations to modernize the Constitution back in the late 70s and 80s, several provinces advocated for the Notwithstanding Clause because they felt that the fundamental rights took the power to make laws out of the hands of elected officials and put them in the hands of the courts. So the federal government conceded this point to the provinces. The point of Section 33 is to prevent the courts from engaging in what is known as judicial activism, which it appears is the case for this Bill 5. Judicial activism is when a judge rules one way or another based on their political bias, not based on the law. Justice Edward Belobaba seemed to be doing this. He ruled that Bill 5 was against Section 2 of the Charter, the right of voters and candidates to express themselves. But to me, if he was to rule one way or another, it would be a violation of the democratic process, since the Ford government tried to implement this in the middle of a municipal election. The freedom of voters and candidates has not been infringed. They can still run, they can still advocate for their position, it just makes their competition much stiffer. There have been many accusations thrown out against Doug Ford. One has been that he is a dictator for circumventing the courts and that it is unconstitutional what he was doing. While it is true that Ford is the first Ontario Premier to use the Notwithstanding clause, it is not unconstitutional because the Charter gives them the authority to do so. The accusation of a dictatorship comes from the people who do not understand the Charter. Section 33 has been in place since 1982, but its origins go back even before that. Also, this is not the first time that the Notwithstanding clause has been enacted by a province. It was enacted in Quebec in 1988 to restrict the posting of certain commercial signs in languages other than French. In 1986, Saskatchewan used it to pass back-to-work legislation when 12,000 provincial workers were striking. They did it again in May 2018 to overrule the Court of Queen's Bench, which ruled that the government could not provide funding for non-Catholic students to attend Catholic schools. Alberta used it in the year 2000 to pass Bill 202, which amended the Alberta Marriage Act. I personally do not like the Notwithstanding clause. It allows the government to circumvent the most valuable rights we have. Ironically, the Notwithstanding clause allows the suspension of our quote-unquote fundamental rights. A fundamental right is defined as a group of rights that have been recognized by the Supreme Court as requiring a high degree of protection from government encroachment. Since he was elected, Doug Ford has received a heavy amount of resistance from every direction, from the opposition, from the press, and from those who don't like him. He has been hauled to court about 7 times now for what he wants to implement, at least 3 of these concerning the rollback of the sex ed curriculum. But it also includes Greenpeace suing the government over the repeal of the cap and trade, scrapping the basic income pilot project, and terminating the task force on part-time and contract work in colleges. Many speculate that Ford, using the Notwithstanding clause, is his way of fighting back against the opposition. When his brother, Rob Ford, was mayor of Toronto, Rob was constantly on the defense from his opponent and the press. It seems to me, and others, that this is a way for Doug Ford to take an offensive step instead of a defensive one. The slashing of Toronto City Councillors was not something that Ford promised to do, but it does fall in line with his beliefs and some of his overarching promises. Ford promised to put more money back in taxpayers' pockets and to have a smaller government than we were used to. This is exactly what Bill 5 does. The average salary of a city councillor these days in Toronto is $112,000, and the Toronto mayor is $192,500. That means that each year it costs the taxpayers $5,456,500. By eliminating 22 city councillors, Ford will save the taxpayers $2,464,000 each year. That goes back into your pocket. I do agree with the idea of Bill 5. Toronto city councillors have proven themselves to be unwilling to act when necessary, and the larger the government, including city council, the more opportunity there is to be corrupt, such as when government contracts were being rigged. This was paving contracts that were rigged to drive up profits while costing taxpayers millions of dollars, or when 2 Toronto city councillors benefited from more than $40,000 in polling and research. One problem that has been more recent is that people are having drug dealers and drug users operating in their neighborhoods outside of their property, and even after contacting their city councillor, nothing has been done about this. While this is a failure on the policing as well, it is definitely a failure on the Toronto City Council. Not to mention the amount of violence that Toronto has been seeing over the last few years. Shooting rates are going up, homicide rates are going up, and Toronto City Council hasn't done anything about it. The idea of suspending our rights and freedoms in order to achieve this goal doesn't sit well with me. The people who are accusing Ford of being a dictator and saying that he is doing what he is doing is unconstitutional are not only wrong, but are putting their focus on the wrong problem. The problem comes from Section 33 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. By focusing on Ford, they are not going to achieve anything. If they truly want this power to be taken away, they need to shift their focus to getting this part of the charter repealed so that no one can restrict our rights again. At the same time, we need to have provisions in place in order to avoid this judicial activism because it is a very real thing, but I'd like to have something in place that doesn't infringe on our charter rights. I do want to shrink the size of city council, but I do not like the way it is being done.